Every day, somewhere in America, more than 300 innocent men, women, and children become victims of medical malpractice at the hands of incompetent and negligent doctors. Last year, over 98,000 victims were killed by doctors. More than 4 million victims are permanently injured each year. Today, the Insider Exclusive goes behind the headlines with Jerry Meyers, one of America's top medical malpractice lawyers, to examine how 3 different incompetent and negligent gynecologists failed to diagnose and treat a 25-year-old mother of 3 who had 7 separate, that's right, 7 separate pap smears that tested abnormal, and yet all 3 doctors failed to do the required further testing to rule out potential cervical cancer. This young mother died 3 years later, in October 2007, from just that, cervical cancer. Every year, over 11,000 women in the U.S. are diagnosed with this cancer. If it is diagnosed early, treatment can be successful. On the other hand, a misdiagnosis can result in delayed treatment. And without the proper treatment, the survival rate decreases considerably, and it sometimes leads to unnecessary and tragic death, as in this case. Jerry Meyers' passion is problem solving. He approaches each medical negligence case as a scientist trying to solve a puzzle. For 10 years, Jerry was on the front lines as a Navy medic and a respiratory therapist. He's seen many patients suffer needless injury, and because of that, he is driven to help people who have been harmed by incompetent and negligent doctors. Jerry's goal? To make medicine safer and more accountable, and of course, to get justice for this young mother and her surviving children orphaned by her untimely death. Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive, live from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at the law firm of Meyers, Giuffre, Evans, and Schwartzwalder. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jerry Meyers to the show. Welcome to the show, Jerry.
Glad to be here, Steve.
You specialize in medical malpractice cases, and your firm does a lot of it, doesn't it?
Yes, but we aren't allowed to say we specialize.
Okay.
All I can say is it's the only kind of work that I've done for 34 years.
Now, you have a kind of an interesting background, is that you came from the medical profession, didn't you?
Yes.
For 10 years, I think you were a Navy corpsman, correct?
No, I was actually for 7 years a respiratory therapist, and before that I was a Navy and Marine corpsman.
Right.
And I needed a job getting out of the service. I applied at various hospitals and talked my way into a job as a respiratory therapist here in Pittsburgh, and I then desperately tried to learn what it was to be one, and I became one, and I loved it.
Right. Now, today we're going to be talking about a case that deals with one of your clients who is deceased now,
yes,
who was misdiagnosed for cervical cancer. But before we start talking about the facts of the case, in your state, in the state of Pennsylvania, you have a law which is called the MCARE law, which you cannot identify the client, the defendant, and that sort of thing. Would you explain for our audience why that is so and what it is exactly, briefly?
MCARE is a organization of the government that pays doctors excess liability claims. MCARE, there is no law passed by our legislature that prevents or that rather enforces confidentiality. But MCARE is a source of the money our clients need in order to solve the economic challenges that they confront every day. Mm. And so if MCARE adopts a regulation which holds that no one may describe the facts of a case, the settlement of a case, the amount of the settlement, and that's a condition of resolving any case,
right,
our clients have no choice but to sign those documents.
To get their money.
That's right.
And that also applies to the identity of the patient, of the client, correct?
The identity of the patient, and regrettably also the identity of the doctors who were responsible.
Yeah, who may still be out there committing acts of malpractice, right?
Who are invariably still out there.
Okay, let's talk about what happened with this case.
to the good mother.
Yes.
Well, this was a young woman who came to me shortly after a diagnosis of invasive cervical cancer had been made. She wanted to know how it was possible, having seen 3 gynecologists over a period of the last 8 years and having had many pap smears, that she developed a disease without it earlier being recognized.
Because if it had been recognized earlier, she might have been able to get treatment and possibly not died, right?
Well, it's not just possibly. If she had been treated, she could have been treated and diagnosed before she had invasive cancer. The cure rate for her disease then would have been virtually 100%.
Right.
Over 4,500 women die of cervical cancer every year in this country. 14,000 new cases diagnosed each year. And virtually all of them are preventable deaths.
Right.
Hers was too.
So she came to you. She wanted to know how was it possible that 3 doctors overlooked this?
Well, I secured her pap smears, the slides which contained the evidence of tissue removed from her cervix for the purpose of determining whether it was normal. That's how cervical cancer evolves. It begins with an abnormality, often mild, of the tissue, the skin of the cervix. As the tissue becomes more involved, the thickness of it becomes more involved, it reaches a point where the entire thickness of the skin has been penetrated by these abnormal cells who no longer know what they're supposed to do, and then it becomes invasive. It goes down. And when it goes down, it can get into lymphatics, blood vessels, and spread, and in her case, it had by the time of diagnosis, and regrettably had awful consequences. Her entire pelvis had to be extenuated. That means they removed all the tissue from her pelvis. She lived on a morphine pump while she was walking around, a portable morphine pump, for the last year of her life.
Wow. Let's talk about some specific mistakes that some of these gynecologists made.
All right. Well, after we had gotten the records and completed our initial investigation, we learned that her first abnormal pap smear actually occurred in 1998. And she then, because it was abnormal, went from the clinic doctor that she had been visiting to a board-certified gynecologist in a hospital, in a good hospital in this city. And that gynecologist did a procedure on her called cryotherapy, where they freeze the tissue, freeze the skin, the superficial skin, from the surface of the cervix. Now, while that is a treatment for the kind of disease she had at the time, it is a terrible mistake to do that before taking a biopsy, because you don't know, but that's all the disease there is. A pap smear is a screening test. It doesn't tell you the full extent of the disease. It simply identifies the disease is present.
Right.
So he should have not done that, but he did do that. Then a year later, he brings her back and he does a colposcopy. A colposcopy is simply a magnified, lighted inspection of a woman's cervix. And you put acetic acid on the cervix, it dehydrates the tissue, and so the nuclei, which are abnormal and always bigger, now reflect more light, makes the lesion look white. And you can see the pink color of the normal tissue of a cervix, and you can see that there's this whiteness. It's obvious. It doesn't take a skilled eye to see it.
Right.
And in that case, after seeing that, he just sent her home.
No biopsy.
No biopsy. And she didn't know that there was anything abnormal that had been found. He was an elderly gynecologist, and he retired the same year. So then she went to a new gynecologist. And the new gynecologist committed a terrible mistake by not getting an accurate history. Very important part of medical care.
So here we have a patient coming from another doctor.
That's right.
And he doesn't even bother get her medical records.
That's right, he didn't. And as a consequence, when he asked her, knowing she had had an abnormal pap smear, if she had had a colposcopy done, and she said yes, he just assumed that it had been properly treated, that there had been a biopsy, it must have been negative, and here she is. And that's what he put in his records.
Mm-hmm.
So the opportunity to have salvaged the entire situation then, and that would have been in 2001,
mm-hmm.
would have left her cured and mother to her 3 kids. But it didn't happen. Instead, what happened was he followed up with a regular pap smear. Her pelvic exam was normal. That pap smear was read as showing atypical cells. It didn't show the severe abnormalities the earlier one had shown, but that doesn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, it's only if you find it, it's important. If you don't find it, it doesn't mean it isn't there. A colposcopy was planned by this doctor, but he never did it. Couldn't explain when he was questioned under oath why. He just didn't do it.
Right.
The next year, another pap smear was done. The laboratory got the requisition that had been filled out by this doctor and his staff. It did not contain any history of her having had a previous abnormal pap smear.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't have any history of her prior cryosurgery. And so, as is usually the case, no doctor looked at the pap smear. You know, most women, I'm sure, believe that doctors have something to do with looking at the tissue that's sent from their gynecologist's office to pathology.
Right. Now, we are going to show on the screen some of these photomicrographs, I believe they're called.
Yes.
That a doctor who was paying attention to things would have noticed precancerous and cancerous cells, correct?
That's right.
And some of them, for example, they have a flat cluster of cells demonstrating HGSIL.
That means it's an acronym for high-grade squamous intraepithelial lesion.
Okay.
It's a lot of gobbledygook.
Yeah.
It's all it means is there is a high degree of abnormality of the nucleus, which is where everything happens in a cell,
right,
which can be visibly seen. Right. The nucleus is big and ugly.
Yeah, it's just kind of curious. I mean, the cells, you have these actual slides.
Yes.
The doctor had them.
Yes.
How come nobody was doing anything about it?
Well, the doctor at the laboratory didn't have them. That was another part of the case,
yeah,
because the laboratory was involved in the case as well.
Right.
Because only 1 in 10 pap smears are ever seen by a physician unless the technologist who looks at the slide first thinks there's something wrong.
And I think there was a problem with the technologist, wasn't
Yeah.
it? Big problem.
It was a big problem.
Who got fired, right?
But not for this.
Yeah.
Not for this. She did get fired a year and a half later for making the same mistake.
Yeah, there was a pattern of conduct where her identification of cancerous cells was far below anybody else's, wasn't it?
Well, it was not only below it, but when she was confronted, when she'd be shown a slide with a doctor sitting beside her on a teaching scope, so they're both seeing the view of the same cells at the same time, and he would point out to this technologist, all right, do you see this? Do you see that? She disagreed.
Yes.
It was actually her refusal to admit she was wrong that caused her to be fired. Now, she admitted she was wrong and had made the mistake when I took her deposition, her sworn testimony, prior to a trial of the case.
Mm-hmm.
And when I showed her the slide, she looked at the inky spots. That's on the low power view, which I think you also have. There are these little dark spots. Yeah. And I said to her, well, when you see these little dark spots and you're flying across the slide at low power, what are you supposed to do? Stop. And when you stop, what do? You increase the magnification.
Right.
So I did it for her. At the deposition, how would you diagnose or evaluate these cells? And she said, oh, I didn't see these cells.
Right.
But she had to.
Now, what happened to your client eventually? She died, right?
Yeah, she died. It spread. Unfortunately for her, it spread to the sacral nerves in her pelvis. Her pain was extraordinary. That's why she lived on a morphine pump.
For how long?
For the last year of her life.
Wow.
While she was caring for her 3 children.
How is cervical cancer usually diagnosed?
By pap smears. Pap smears are a miracle. they were invented, the technique was invented in the late 40s by a fellow with a strange name, Papa Niccolo. That's where the word pap comes from.
Okay, Papa Niccolo?
Yes, Dr. Papa Niccolo. And the stain, which is used to illustrate in a cell what's abnormal,
Yes.
is a Papa Niccolo stain. That's where the word comes from. So what happens is they scrape tissue off the cervix, they smear it onto a glass slide. It's then examined under a microscope after a stain has been applied,
Yeah.
which will make the cells stand out.
Right.
And then you look at low magnification first. To identify the area of the cell, you have to examine more carefully. And then you magnify it. Once magnified, cancer cells are easy to see. They're ugly.
Yeah.
They're just ugly cells.
Then really the question is asked, how does misdiagnosis happen?
Because under our current federal law, a technologist can look at 80 slides a day. So in an 8 hour, it's what, 6 minutes a
Right.
slide?
What kind of training does a technologist have to be able to be at a critical junction in making sure that identifying cancerous or precancerous cells and notifying physicians? What's their background? What's their training?
Well, they have less than a year of
That's
formal, yeah.
So people with less than a year of training are really at a critical juncture in making sure that people who have possibly cancer are treated at the right time.
Yes, and this is occurring at a time when the woman whose tissue has been sent for examination, the woman who's had the pap smear, has no idea that a person with this little training can do it. Now, it's important to remember they have better trained technologists. They're called cytotechnology supervisors.
Yeah.
And so if anything is seen abnormal at all, what the tech is supposed to do
Notify
is
the
just
supervisor.
tell the supervisor.
Yeah.
They don't have to know anything except, ooh, that's different.
Yeah.
That's odd. And that's all they have to do. But it's like looking but not seeing.
Yeah.
It's come before their eyes, but they don't see it.
What was your legal strategy to win this case?
Well, we took depositions of all the people involved.
Yes.
We forced the laboratory to produce all of their internal documents, which revealed what their test results were on all the cytotechnologists. We were able to demonstrate that this cytotechnologist had a much lower than the average of a laboratory read of abnormal, seriously abnormal cells. We questioned her, gained her admissions, and built a very strong case for their negligence. The obstetrician gynecologist who was responsible for not taking the proper history, for not doing the colposcopy and so on, had no explanations. In other words, we simply assembled increasingly a mass of evidence. Then a trial was scheduled, and our client was still alive, and active settlement negotiations proceeded, but she had one of her 3 children was disabled. I think that they thought that if she died, the case would have less value.
That is horrible.
Yeah, but it didn't. In fact, because she died, she left a child who had a congenital disability, a serious one.
And they're orphaned.
And they were orphaned.
A lot of people are watching this show, and in closing, some people may have some questions about what's the definition of medical malpractice? How do you know that you've been treated wrong by a doctor or misdiagnosed or whatever? How do you know these things?
Well, most people don't. What they need to do, what the ordinary citizen needs to do, is to ask questions, understand what's happening, what's expected to happen, and when the unexpected occurs, should seek an answer explaining it. If they don't understand the answer the doctor's given them, they should go to someone like me.
Yeah. As a result of some of the cases that you've handled, including this one, do you see changes in the medical industry holding them more accountable, their feet to the fire, in doctors being more responsible for what they're doing?
No.
You don't?
I wish I did. I'd love to take credit for it. Part of the problem in Pennsylvania is that no one knows. I mean, the case I've just described, for example, no one knows about it. No one knows these facts. And if they don't know it, then when someone talks about frivolous lawsuits, why shouldn't they think that it's all frivolous? After all, lawyers have never been very popular.
Right, right. But thank God you're there helping the people who need help, and I want to really appreciate you being on this show.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.